I'm really delighted to be invited to share some of the information about nonviolent action that's accumulated over the years. I've been part of that development of understanding because I started as a very young man looking into this phenomenon of nonviolent action, and I've also been an activist, so I've experienced both sides, both the scholarly side and the activist side. And to me, it's one of the most exciting things that's going on. One reason being that it has historically happened in every country that we've looked into. The Global Nonviolent Action Database that we've been building at Swarthmore College includes cases from virtually all the countries in the world, 194 countries so far. We have documented cases of nonviolent action. Nonviolent action is also called civil resistance, so the term isn't fully set yet. But scholarship is increasing in understanding what is really going on when people fight for something or people intervene in something nonviolently and still with effect or with force. It's not something that always works, that's for sure. No particular pattern of life always works. But it works frequently enough so that more and more people seem to be trying it out. What I found is that there are three different applications of nonviolent action. That is, it's three different uses of it. And these three, as I identify them, are change and defense and civilian peacekeeping. In change examples, what we see is people who don't like something about the status quo and then are rallying their forces in order to change it. Probably the most famous example would be the Gandhi example. That's a name. Mohandas Gandhi is associated with nonviolent action. And his leadership of India is a great example of changing a relationship between a major country and a major empire, the British Empire. And they did that over, of course, many years because there's nothing magical about nonviolent action. But they succeeded. Another example that comes to mind, I think, for most people in the world, an awareness that the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa was waged, for the most part, nonviolently. They had their armed struggle phases, but they had very serious nonviolent struggle phases, and the post-1982 phase was particularly striking for mass use of nonviolent action. And a third name that a lot of folks know around the world is Martin Luther King and the US Civil Rights Movement. And again, it's an example of change. One thing that I like about the Civil Rights Movement is it shows that change can be used on a very micro level as well as on a macro level. So that you find, for example, in the US South, people changing the racial discrimination, ending racial discrimination in very small contexts, in restaurants and so on, by very small numbers of people, as well as participation in a city like Montgomery, Alabama, of 50,000 people boycotting the bus system and getting their change that way. So that's the change application. Defense, people don't usually think about defense so much because there's something about nonviolent action associated with activism and activism associated with change. And what we often forget is that nonviolent action is often used to retain the status quo rather than to change it. For example, to retain the rainforests rather than to allow them to be exploited, or to save the whales rather than to allow them to be hunted. And so actually, defense is a very widely used application of nonviolent action in the environmental field. It's also been used with regard to whole nation states. For example, after World War I, in Germany, the Weimar Republic was threatened by a coup d'etat, which involved the military trying to take the state away from the constitutionally elected government. And in that contest, it was the decision by the legitimate government to call on the people to do what was in effect a general strike that stopped the military from being successful and retained the democracy of the Weimar Republic. So we do find, again, from a micro to a macro level, the application of defense. Another example of the micro level would be neighborhood level. There are many, many cases, far more than we can categorize in the database, although we're trying to include more and more, in which neighborhoods will defend themselves against, say, the drug trade moving into their neighborhood and taking it over, or against a highway that's slated by planners to go through their neighborhood and destroy the community. And there are more and more neighborhoods that stand up for themselves and successfully, sometimes unsuccessfully, but either way, use nonviolent action in order to defend themselves. So there you've got change, you have defense. Now this third category is quite different, because here you've got polarization, right? You've got two sides who are fighting it out. Sometimes one side is using violence and the other side is using nonviolent action. Once in a while, both sides are trying to do nonviolent action. But anyway, these are polarized situations, and what we're looking at is two sides fighting it out. In this one, what we're looking at is a form of nonviolent action in which the third party enters the situation and tries to encourage the struggle to get resolved in a way that is right for those two sides, but which is not imposed by the third party that comes in and tries to maintain peacekeeping. Sometimes it's called unarmed civilian peacekeeping in order to underline the importance of the nonviolent side of it. And sometimes it's called third party nonviolent intervention in order to emphasize that this is a third party. It's used sometimes when there are people who don't have a dog in that particular fight, but know that if the fight continues to escalate, that it's going to come around and hurt lots of people, maybe hurt everybody. It's also used in situations where people might be moved from a place of compassion, or they might be, and so it's a kind of humanitarian intervention, or it might come from a place where people just believe that there will be a more democratic outcome of that particular struggle if a third party comes in and opens more space instead of it being closed down by the dynamics of violence. And so what people have discovered is, so far, 4 different forms or 4 different interventions that can be used in situations like that. So I'll describe them briefly, but also I'll ask you to understand that there might be a 5th that will be invented any day now, and a 6th and a 7th. This is a very fluid and rapidly developing field. The first, interposition. I always think, when I think of interposition, about the extraordinary bravery of the Indians who, inspired by Gandhi, but after his death, created a peace army for intervening in Hindu-Muslim struggles, where there'd be violent riots, where people would be really, sometimes a whole city would get engulfed in the rioting, sometimes only a section of the city, but with really bad results. So what the third party would do, what these Shanti Sainiks, as they called themselves, did, was to go into that city and sometimes wade right into the middle of a riotous situation, and in distinctive garb, often waving banners that would enable them to look around and see, oh yes, that person's still going, okay, oh good, those folks are going fine, to operate in a way that chilled the atmosphere and saved lives. They did that in a number of cities. It was a very exciting development, the Shanti Sena in India. Somewhat localized, sometimes somewhat broader other times. But interposition can be used in a very micro level. I've talked with people who were bartenders who found that when there were 2 guys who were getting drunk and getting hostile to each other and about to go into a physical fight, that they found it quite effective to step between the 2 guys and stop their fighting by doing that in a nonviolent way. So interposition can be very micro, it can be very macro. The most macro participation that I know of was the situation in the Philippines in 1986, when the dictatorship, Marcos, was being very strongly challenged by a movement that called itself People Power. And in the process of being challenged, part of the army broke away and joined the democracy movement. And so you had a situation where this small part of the army going to a military base, hoping to, stay alive, being pursued by the larger part of the army, whose job it was to reclaim them. And the Roman Catholic Cardinal of Manila said to the people on Catholic radio, show up at this spot where the confrontation will happen. Over 1 million people responded. And the 1 million people got in between the larger army and the smaller army. And so here you have an extraordinary example of nonviolence defending a military group that couldn't defend itself. And it was the nonviolent intervention that made the difference. So that's a very big example of interposition. Many more cases can be found of all of this in the database, which is online and available for you to check out on the website. Now, the second form, or second intervention mode, is the one that's gone most mainstream. So we all know about monitoring elections or monitoring truces, for example, and observing, third-party observing of elections. That's done quite a lot. The Carter Center has been one of the great developers of that, but it's become very mainstream. And it's a great example of how you can actually hold people accountable and reduce their inclination to do violence if they know they are being watched and that they will be put in the carpet, if only in the view of public opinion. It will still constrain their range of motion in a useful way. So I won't talk much about that because that's so well known. This one is not so well known, this protective accompaniment. That's not so well known because it's done usually in a very minute and nuanced way. It's when people are under threat. Very often these are human rights defenders who are under threat of assassination, that kind of thing. And a third party comes in, peace teams, they're often called, and accompany the folks who are under threat. They become, in effect, unarmed bodyguards. And their very accompaniment keeps people alive who otherwise would be killed. That's been done in a number of places in Central America. Around the world, there have been various situations in which these third-party folks have come in and done protective accompaniment. And I remember one government official, a foreign minister of one of the European states, at a conference saying, what the world needs is far more nonviolent, non-government organizations doing these interventions with protective accompaniment to keep people alive so that they can fight the battles that need to be fought in their countries for democracy, for human rights, for freedom. Finally, we get to presence, which is an interesting new form. It's so new, it's even hard to define. I find it hard to define. I'll say that there is a phenomenon, you may have run into it in your own life, in which you could say there's a force field of conflict. And that an outsider can enter that force field and shift the dynamics of it in such a way as to reduce the chances of people getting killed, reduce even injury, sometimes even stop injury from going on by their sheer presence. How they do it depends. One way is of course interposition, but this is different. This is not having to actually get between, but it's still being present in such a way as to shift the dynamic. One example that was told to me by the Russian human rights group Memorial was that they had experiences in the Caucasus where they would go into a field of strife and through acts of service influence the conduct of the conflict. For example, arranging prisoner exchanges in a situation where the contending forces were in no shape to be able to do that, too scared. It's been done in Colombia by peacekeeping groups to, for example, bury bodies that otherwise will lie there because people are afraid to bury the bodies. And yet these usually subtle interventions that I'm loosely calling presence can make a difference. So, as I mentioned, there's probably, as we speak, somebody inventing an E and an F and a G, because this is a very vital and creative field. Because, let's face it, most places in the world, people are tired of violence. They want a better way to move forward. Yes, they want to fight, they want to change things, or they want to do defense, and defend the status quo, defend that rainforest or whatever it is, defend indigenous groups, defending their space from extraction and so on. Yes, they want to do those things, and then there are people who want to increase peace in the world. Folks are creative. One of the things we can do is learn how to do that kind of thing and to study it more to try to understand what are the strategic dynamics that make those cases that are successful as powerful as they are. Thank you very much.